The notification appeared on Jessica Torres's phone screen at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, and she stared at it for a full minute before deciding whether to respond. The profile name was Alexander Cross, 62 years old, and his main photo showed a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than her rent. He was standing in what looked like a high-end restaurant, a glass of wine in his hand, and his smile suggested someone who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. The message was direct without being crude. "I'm visiting Miami on business and would appreciate sophisticated company for dinner tonight. Are you available? Compensation will be generous." Jessica sat on the worn couch in her studio apartment in Little Havana, surrounded by unpaid bills and the remnants of a life that had slowly unraveled over the past 8 months. At 28, she had imagined herself in a completely different place by now, maybe working her way up in marketing, living in a decent neighborhood, perhaps even engaged to someone who made her laugh. Instead, she was 3 months behind on rent. Her car had been repossessed 2 weeks ago, and her credit cards were maxed out from trying to keep her mother's medical bills from going to collections. The descent had been gradual, but relentless. First, the layoff from the tech startup that had promised equity and growth, but instead ran out of venture capital funding. Then, her mother's breast cancer diagnosis, which came with treatments that insurance barely covered. Jessica had burned through her savings in 4 months, took odd jobs waitressing and retail that barely made a dent in the mounting debt. Her boyfriend had left when things got difficult, unable or unwilling to deal with her stress and financial chaos. That was when the suggestion had come from Natalie, a former co-worker who always seemed to have money despite not having a steady job. Over drinks at a South Beach bar that Jessica could no longer afford, Natalie had explained her arrangement with certain wealthy men who valued discretion and were willing to pay handsomely for companionship. "It's not what you think," Natalie had said, though her eyes suggested it was exactly what Jessica thought. "These are successful businessmen who want someone attractive and intelligent to talk to, someone who makes them feel desired. What happens beyond that is between consenting adults." Jessica had downloaded the dating app that night, drunk and desperate, and had been scrolling through profiles ever since, never quite finding the courage to actually meet anyone. Until now. Until the bills had piled so high that courage was no longer a requirement, only necessity. She looked around her cramped studio apartment with its peeling paint and the persistent smell of mildew that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. Through the thin walls, she could hear her neighbor's television blaring a Spanish telenovela, the dramatic music punctuating her own internal crisis. Outside, Miami pulsed with its usual chaotic energy, a city of extremes where wealth and poverty existed side by side, where the Art Deco glamour of South Beach was just miles from neighborhoods where people struggled to survive. Jessica studied Alexander Cross's profile more carefully. His other photos showed him at various upscale locations, a yacht in Biscayne Bay, a rooftop bar with the Miami skyline glowing behind him, what looked like a private jet interior. His bio was minimal but polished. Entrepreneur and investor seeking genuine connections with intelligent, attractive women. I value discretion, sophistication, and mutual respect. The phrase, "compensation will be generous," echoed in her mind. Natalie had told her that men like this typically paid anywhere from $500 to $2,000 for an evening, depending on what was expected. That money could mean the difference between eviction and stability, between her mother's next treatment and medical debt collectors calling every hour. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She had rules, or at least she told herself she did. No one under 50, always meet in public first, payment up front, no promises beyond one night, and absolutely no emotional attachment. But rules were for people who had choices, and Jessica's choices had evaporated along with her bank account. She typed a response, her heart pounding. "Good afternoon. I would be delighted to join you for dinner. What did you have in mind?" His reply came within minutes. "The Setai Hotel on South Beach at 8 p.m. I'm staying in the penthouse suite if you'd like to meet there first for drinks. I'm in the Ocean Penthouse. $1,000 for the evening, cash." Jessica read the message 3 times to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. $1,000 was more than she had earned in the past 2 weeks combined. It was enough to pay her landlord, enough to buy another month, to refill her mother's prescriptions, to buy groceries that weren't ramen noodles and canned soup. The Setai was one of Miami Beach's most exclusive hotels, the kind of place where celebrities stayed, and where a single night in a standard room cost what Jessica used to make in a week at her old job. A small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings. Why would a wealthy man visiting Miami pay so much for dinner with a stranger? What kind of business brought someone to the city with that level of disposable income? And why specify the penthouse suite up front for drinks? But the voice was quickly drowned out by the louder, more insistent sound of her landlord's threats, her mother's worried calls about medical bills, the notification on her phone that her bank account was overdrawn again. Jessica had taken risks her entire life, from moving to Miami with $800 in her pocket and a dream of making it in digital marketing, to staying in a relationship far longer than she should have because she was afraid of being alone. This was just another calculated gamble, and the potential payoff was too significant to pass up. She responded with a message. "The Setai sounds perfect. What time for drinks?" 7 p.m. Ask for the Ocean Penthouse elevator. My name is Alexander Cross. Dress elegantly. Alexander Cross. The name sounded sophisticated, international, like someone who divided his time between New York and London. Jessica imagined a wealthy widower, perhaps a successful businessman from Silicon Valley or a hedge fund manager taking a break from the stress of Wall Street. She had dealt with wealthy men before in her marketing career, men who made fortunes and had no qualms about spending it on whatever made them feel young and desirable again. She spent the rest of the afternoon preparing with more care than she had put into anything in months. Her best dress was a simple black number that she had bought for a company holiday party back when she had a company to work for. It hugged her curves in all the right places, elegant without being provocative. She borrowed heels from her neighbor Maria, who asked no questions but gave her a knowing look that said more than words could. Jessica stood in front of her bathroom mirror, applying makeup with hands that trembled slightly. Her reflection showed a woman who still looked good, despite the stress and sleepless nights. At 28, she had dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, brown eyes that men often complimented, and olive skin that tanned easily under the Florida sun. She had maintained her figure through stress and poverty, though now it was less from exercise and more from not being able to afford to eat much. At 6:30 p.m., Jessica called an Uber, unable to afford the luxury, but equally unable to show up at the Setai on a public bus. The driver navigated through early evening traffic on the MacArthur Causeway, and she watched as the Miami skyline transformed into the distinctive Art Deco architecture of South Beach. The setting sun painted everything in shades of orange and pink, making the whole city look like a postcard designed to sell dreams. The Setai rose before her like a temple to luxury, its Asian-inspired architecture a stark contrast to the Art Deco buildings surrounding it. Jessica had walked past it countless times during her early days in Miami, when she and her friends would spend weekends exploring South Beach, never imagining she would someday enter through its doors under these circumstances. The valet took one look at her arriving in an Uber, and his expression shifted subtly, but he maintained professional courtesy as he directed her to the entrance. Inside, the lobby was all dark wood, ambient lighting, and the subtle scent of expensive candles. Guests moved through the space with the casual confidence of people who belonged there, speaking in multiple languages about destinations and experiences that existed far beyond Jessica's current reality. She approached the concierge desk, trying to project a confidence she did not feel. "I'm here to see Alexander Cross in the Ocean Penthouse," she said, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. The concierge, an impeccably dressed man in his 40s, looked her up and down with an expression that managed to be both professional and slightly judgmental. "Of course, miss. The penthouse elevator is just past the main elevators, around the corner to your left. Mr. Cross is expecting you." As Jessica walked toward the penthouse elevator, she caught sight of herself in the mirrored walls. She looked the part, she had to admit. The borrowed heels, the black dress, the carefully applied makeup all created an image of sophistication that almost hid the desperation underneath. Almost. The penthouse elevator was smaller and more luxurious than the main ones, with dark wood paneling and soft lighting that made everything feel like a movie set. As it ascended toward the top floor, Jessica felt her stomach flutter with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. In less than an hour, she would be $1,000 richer, or she would be dealing with whatever complications came from getting involved with a man she knew nothing about. The elevator doors opened directly into the foyer of the penthouse, and Jessica stepped into a space that redefined her understanding of luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the Atlantic Ocean and South Beach below. The furniture was modern and expensive, with clean lines and rich fabrics that probably cost more than her car had been worth. Fresh orchids adorned every surface, and the air carried a light scent of sandalwood. "You must be Jessica," said a voice behind her, and she turned to see Alexander Cross in person for the first time. He was even more striking than his photos suggested, with sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through her. His silver hair was styled perfectly, and he wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing tanned, muscular forearms that suggested he maintained his fitness despite his age. He moved with the deliberate grace of someone who was completely comfortable in his own skin. "Mr. Cross," Jessica said, extending her hand. "Thank you for inviting me. This view is incredible." "Alexander, please," he said, taking her hand in both of his. His skin was warm but dry, and he held the contact a moment longer than necessary. "And yes, I love this view. There's something special about being above everything, don't you think? It gives you perspective." He moved toward a well-stocked bar in the corner with movements that were elegant and deliberate. "What would you like to drink? I have an excellent scotch, or perhaps something more tropical. After all, we are in Miami." "Scotch sounds perfect," Jessica replied, watching as he poured generous measures into crystal glasses. He handed her one, and their fingers brushed again. She noticed he wore no wedding ring, only a large sapphire on his right hand that looked antique and expensive. "To new experiences," Alexander said, raising his glass. "To new experiences," Jessica repeated, though something in his tone made the words feel heavier than they should. As they talked, Jessica found herself relaxing despite her initial nervousness. Alexander was charming and well-traveled, sharing stories about business ventures in Barcelona and art galleries in New York. He asked about her life in Miami and seemed genuinely interested in her childhood in Tampa and her complicated relationship with the city that had both welcomed and defeated her. She found herself being more honest than she had planned, telling him about her mother's illness and the financial pressures that had brought her to this moment. "You know," Alexander said after they finished their second round of drinks, "I think we should skip dinner at the restaurant tonight. I find myself much more interested in getting to know you better here. Would that be all right with you?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Jessica looked into his piercing blue eyes and felt something shift in the room, a subtle change in pressure that made her skin tingle. Outside, the Miami beach skyline had come alive with lights, and the city had transformed into a glittering constellation of possibilities and dangers. That sounds perfect, she heard herself say, though a small voice in the back of her mind screamed warnings she chose to ignore. Alexander smiled, and for an instant Jessica could have sworn his eyes gleamed with something predatory. But then he moved closer, placing his hand on her arm, and all rational thought dissolved into the warm Florida night and the promise of easy money that had brought her to this moment. Alexander guided her deeper into the penthouse, past the main living area toward a more intimate corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Miami skyline stretched infinitely before them, a tapestry of lights that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the city. He indicated she should sit on a plush velvet sofa while he moved to what appeared to be a small bar hidden in a corner. "I have something special I'd like you to try," Alexander said, his back to her as he manipulated bottles and glasses. "It's a family recipe from my grandmother's time. She used to say it brought people closer together." Jessica settled into the sofa, feeling the expensive fabric beneath her hands. Everything in the penthouse breathed wealth and refinement, from the original artwork hanging on the walls to the fresh orchids that seemed to be in every room. Through the massive windows, she could see the lights of South Beach, the Art Deco hotels glowing like neon jewels along the coast. "Where is your family from?" she asked, genuinely curious. Alexander's accent was subtle, but suggested European roots, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly where. "England," he responded, though something in his tone suggested the answer was more complicated than that. "My grandmother was from a very old family in Yorkshire. She taught me many things about traditional remedies and preparations." He returned with a tray, holding 2 crystal glasses filled with a deep red liquid that looked almost black in the ambient lighting. The glasses were exquisite, cut crystal that refracted the city lights into tiny rainbows. Alexander sat beside her on the sofa, closer than before, and Jessica caught the scent of his cologne, something exotic and woody that reminded her of cedar mixed with something earthier she couldn't identify. "What is it?" Jessica asked, accepting the glass. The liquid had an unusual consistency, slightly thicker than wine, and gave off a scent that was both sweet and metallic. "Lifeblood," Alexander said with a smile. "Don't worry, it's just an old name for a mixture of herbs and fruits. My grandmother swore it enhanced the connection between people." Jessica brought the glass to her lips, hesitating for an instant. There was something about the drink that bothered her, though she couldn't say exactly what. But Alexander was watching her with those piercing blue eyes, and his expression was so expectant that she found it impossible to refuse. The liquid hit her tongue with an explosion of flavors she had never experienced before. At first, it was sweet like pomegranate or cherry, but underneath were tastes she couldn't identify. Herbs that seemed to tingle on her tongue, spices that warmed her throat as she swallowed. Almost immediately, she felt a wave of heat spreading through her chest and limbs. "This is incredible," she said, and her voice sounded different, deeper and more resonant. "I've never tasted anything like it." Alexander smiled and took a sip from his glass, though Jessica noticed he barely wet his lips before setting it aside. "My grandmother used to say that some recipes are too potent to consume frequently. You have to savor them, enjoy them completely." As they continued talking, Jessica felt increasingly relaxed, almost euphoric. The city lights seemed brighter, more vivid, and Alexander's voice took on an almost musical quality. When he moved closer to touch her hand, his fingers produced an electric sensation on her skin. "Tell me your dreams, Jessica," he said, lowering his voice to almost a whisper. "What do you desire most in this world?" The question seemed profound in her altered state, and Jessica found herself speaking with unusual honesty. "I want to matter," she heard herself say. "I want to be more than just another person struggling to pay rent. I want to leave something behind, to be remembered." Alexander's eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. Memory is a powerful thing. Some people remain alive in ways they never imagined. He moved closer, sliding his hand up her arm, and Jessica felt her pulse quicken. The drink continued to take effect, intensifying all her sensations. When Alexander leaned in to kiss her, it was like touching a live wire. What followed became a dreamlike sequence that Jessica would have difficulty reconstructing later. Alexander led her to the master bedroom, a space dominated by an enormous bed and more floor-to-ceiling windows offering an unobstructed view of the Atlantic Ocean. Candles appeared from somewhere, dozens of them filling the room with flickering light and the scent of something that wasn't quite jasmine. Alexander moved with a confidence that was both seductive and slightly unsettling. There was nothing hesitant or self-conscious about him despite his age. If anything, he seemed to come more alive as the night progressed, his skin taking on an almost luminous quality in the candlelight. As they made love, Jessica felt she was experiencing something beyond the purely physical. The drink Alexander had given her seemed to intensify every sensation, making her skin hypersensitive to his touch. Time became fluid, moments stretching into hours, or perhaps hours compressing into moments. At some point, she realized Alexander was whispering words she didn't understand, phrases that might have been in English, but sounded older, more archaic. The candles flickered in patterns that seemed almost choreographed, and Jessica found herself caught up in rhythms that felt primitive, ancestral. Alexander's hands guided her with surprising strength, and his whispered words took on the cadence of an incantation. The room seemed to pulse with energy, and the Miami skyline beyond the windows became a blur of light and shadow. Throughout it all, Jessica felt as if something was being taken from her, as if some essential part of herself was flowing toward Alexander with each breath, each heartbeat, each moment of connection. It wasn't unpleasant, quite the opposite, but it left her with a simultaneous feeling of exhilaration and exhaustion. The last thing she remembered clearly was Alexander's face above her in the candlelight, his features seeming to shift and transform, becoming younger and more vibrant, while shadows danced across the walls like living things. Then exhaustion overtook her, plunging her into the deepest sleep she had ever experienced. When Jessica woke, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The penthouse, which had been alive with subtle sounds of luxury throughout the night, the whisper of air conditioning, the distant murmur of the city, now seemed completely dead. Even the ever-present sound of Miami traffic seemed muffled and distant. The second thing she noticed was the cold. Despite the warm Florida night, her skin was clammy, and her muscles ached as if she had run a marathon. The sheets beneath her were soaked with sweat that had already begun to cool. "Alexander!" she called, her voice cracking. No response came from the darkened suite. Jessica tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the room spun violently. The bedroom looked different in the pale dawn light filtering through the massive windows. The candles had disappeared, along with their lingering scent. The space felt sterile, unused, as if no one had been there for days. Forcing herself to stand, Jessica stumbled toward the bathroom on unsteady legs. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, her reflection shocked her. Her face was pale, almost grey, and her eyes were sunken with dark circles that made her look years older. But it was when she looked down that real panic set in. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The pain came then, a burning sensation that made her double over and gasp. She gripped the marble countertop to stay upright, and that was when she caught the smell, something sour and unpleasant that seemed to be coming from her own body. "Alexander!" she screamed, and her voice echoed through the empty penthouse. But even as she called for him, Jessica knew he was gone. The silence was too absolute, too final. Staggering back into the main living area, she searched for any trace of the man who had brought her there. The bar where he had prepared the drinks showed no signs of recent use. The sofa where they had sat was perfectly arranged, cushions fluffed as if no one had touched them. Even the crystal glasses had vanished, leaving no trace of the strange red liquid that had triggered everything. Jessica's hands trembled as she searched for her clothes scattered across the bedroom floor. Getting dressed was agony, each movement sending new waves of pain through her body. Her phone showed multiple missed calls from her mother and a text from her landlord demanding payment. The discoloration she had glimpsed in the bathroom mirror was spreading, dark patches that looked almost purple against her skin. The burning sensation intensified with each passing moment, and she could feel something fundamentally wrong happening inside her body. In the early morning light of Miami Beach, Jessica made her way unsteadily toward the penthouse elevator, leaving behind a suite that looked as if it had been professionally cleaned and reset. The concierge who had greeted her the night before was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a different man who barely looked up as she passed. Outside, the valet area was empty. Her Uber app wouldn't load properly, her hands shaking too badly to type. Finally, she managed to request a ride, collapsing against the hotel's exterior wall as she waited, trying to make sense of what had happened to her. The driver gave her concerned looks in the rearview mirror during the ride back to Little Havana, but asked no questions. Miami was that kind of city where people learn not to inquire too deeply into others' business. By the time she reached her studio apartment, a terrible certainty had crystallized in Jessica's mind. Whatever Alexander Cross had done to her, it was far from over. She barely made it up the concrete stairs to her building before her legs gave out. She collapsed against the rusted metal railing, gasping for air as waves of nausea washed over her. The morning heat was already intensifying, but her skin felt cold and damp despite the rising temperature. Inside her apartment, Jessica stumbled directly to the bathroom, desperate to examine what her body was telling her was terribly wrong. Under the harsh lighting, what she saw made her knees buckle. The skin around her genitals was discolored, with red patches mixed with areas that looked almost grey. The smell that had been bothering her since she woke up was definitely coming from her own body, a sour, organic odor that turned her stomach. "Oh, God," she whispered, switching unconsciously to Spanish in her moment of stress. "What did he do to me?" She tried to remember the details of the previous night, but everything after Alexander's strange drink remained frustratingly blurry. She remembered his hands on her, his words whispered in that language she couldn't identify, the sensation that something was being pulled from deep within her. But the specifics dissolved like smoke whenever she tried to focus on them. The pain was getting worse, a burning sensation that radiated from her groin into her lower abdomen. Jessica turned on the sink faucet and splashed cold water on her face, trying to clear her mind enough to think rationally. She needed medical attention. That was obvious. But the thought of explaining this situation to a doctor at a hospital filled her with panic. How would she tell them that a man had paid her for sex and then disappeared without a trace? How would she explain the strange drink, the whispers, the way the entire penthouse suite had seemed to vibrate with supernatural energy? They would think she was delusional or that she'd been poisoned with some exotic drug. Her phone buzzed with another text from her mother, asking if she could help with the next round of medical bills. The irony wasn't lost on Jessica. She had sold herself to help pay for her mother's treatment, and now she was the one who needed emergency medical care. With trembling hands, Jessica called her best friend Monica, the only person she trusted enough to help her in this situation. "I need you to take me to the hospital," she said when Monica answered. "Something's really wrong." Monica arrived within 20 minutes, and the look on her face when she saw Jessica told her everything she needed to know about how bad she looked. Her best friend since college, Monica had seen her through breakups, job losses, and family crises, but nothing had prepared her for this. Jesus, Jess, what happened to you? Monica asked, helping her down the stairs to her car. I don't know, Jessica said, which was both true and a lie. I just need to get to a hospital. The drive to Jackson Memorial Hospital felt endless despite the relatively light mid-morning traffic. Jessica sat in the passenger seat, arms wrapped around her midsection, trying to manage the waves of pain that kept getting stronger. Through the car window, she watched Miami pass by, the city going about its business, completely indifferent to her suffering. The emergency room was already crowded, despite the early hour. Miami's population of shift workers, tourists, and people living on society's margins meant that Jackson Memorial never truly slept. They took a number and sat in plastic chairs that had seen better decades, surrounded by the familiar sounds of multiple languages and the smell of disinfectant that seemed universal to all hospitals. Do you want to tell me what really happened? Monica asked quietly, keeping her voice low in the crowded waiting room. Jessica looked at the other patients, a construction worker with a bandaged hand, an elderly Cuban woman clutching her purse and speaking rapidly in Spanish to her daughter, a young mother trying to soothe her feverish toddler. These were her people, Miami's working-class families who couldn't afford private doctors or expensive health insurance. Last night I met someone, she began carefully. A man. He was staying at the Setai and said he was here on business. He paid me to... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Monica nodded without judgment. She knew about Jessica's financial struggles, had even lent her money she could barely spare. And? He gave me something to drink, said it was a family recipe. After that, everything gets fuzzy. But when I woke up this morning, he was gone and I... Jessica gestured helplessly at her body. Look at me, Monica. I look like I've aged 10 years overnight. It was true. Under the harsh waiting room lights, Jessica looked haggard and pale, with no trace of her usual vitality. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her skin had taken on a sickly greyish tone that made her look seriously ill. Jessica Torres? Called a nurse, mispronouncing her last name in a way that had irritated her since elementary school. The examination room was small and sterile, with medical equipment that looked like it had been state-of-the-art sometime in the 1990s. Jackson Memorial was famous for exhausting its residents, and Dr. Michael Chen looked like he had been working 36-hour shifts, which was probably the case. "What brings you in today?" he asked, consulting his clipboard. Jessica explained her symptoms as clinically as possible, omitting the stranger details about Alexander and focusing on the physical reality of her condition. Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly concerned as he examined her. "Have you been exposed to any chemicals recently? Any new medications or recreational drugs?" he asked. "Nothing like that," Jessica responded. "Just the drink I mentioned." "I'm going to need to run some blood tests," Dr. Chen said. "What you're describing doesn't match any STD or infection pattern I'm familiar with. The tissue damage is unusual." He drew several vials of blood, each one looking disturbingly dark under the fluorescent lights. "I want you to stay here while we process these. If this is some kind of poisoning, we need to identify it quickly." Hours passed in the sterile examination room. Monica brought coffee and sandwiches from the hospital cafeteria, though Jessica had no appetite. The pain continued to worsen, and she noticed the discoloration was spreading, creeping up her abdomen in tendrils that looked almost black against her olive skin. When Dr. Chen returned, his expression was grim. "I've never seen blood work like this," he admitted. "Your white blood cell count is through the roof, but we can't identify any bacteria or virus causing the infection. Your tissue is necrotic at a rate that defies medical explanation." "Necrotic?" Jessica repeated, though she already feared what the word meant. "Dying," Dr. Chen said bluntly. "Your tissue is dying from the inside out. and we don't know why. I'm admitting you for observation and putting you on broad-spectrum antibiotics, but honestly, I'm not sure they're going to help." And as they prepared to transfer her to a room upstairs, Jessica caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The change in just a few hours was shocking. Her face was more gaunt, her skin more greyish, and her eyes had taken on a sunken appearance that made her look like a completely different person. "Monica," she said, as her friend prepared to leave. "That man, Alexander Cross. If something happens to me, you have to find him. Promise me." Monica squeezed her hand tightly. "Nothing's going to happen to you. The doctors will figure it out." But as Jessica lay in the narrow hospital bed that night, listening to the sounds of the city beyond her window, she knew that what was happening to her was beyond the reach of modern medicine. Alexander had done something to her, taken something from her, and every passing hour confirmed that he had never intended for her to survive their encounter. Detective Marcus Webb had seen plenty of strange cases during his 15 years with the Miami-Dade Police Department, but the call from Jackson Memorial Hospital that Wednesday afternoon caught his attention like few others. A young woman was dying from rapid tissue necrosis with no apparent cause, and the attending physician suspected foul play. Webb had worked everything from drug-related shootings to elaborate fraud schemes targeting Miami's wealthy retirees. At 42, he had earned his detective's badge through hard work, putting in twice the hours of many colleagues in a department that was slowly learning to value dedication over politics. Dr. Michael Chen met him in the hospital lobby, looking exhausted and frustrated. "I've been practicing medicine for 8 years, and I've never seen a case like this. The patient's tissue is dying at an inexplicable rate, and every test we've run comes back negative for known toxins or pathogens." They walked through the hospital corridors toward the 4th floor. "Tell me about the patient," Webb said. "Jessica Torres, 28 years old, previously healthy. She came in yesterday morning with symptoms that initially suggested some type of infection, but the progression doesn't match anything in medical literature. Dr. Chen warned him about the smell and appearance before entering room 428. Jessica Torres lay connected to various monitors, her face pale and drawn. Even from across the room, Webb could detect the sour organic smell. What struck him most was how much older she looked than her stated age. "Ms. Torres," Webb said gently, showing his badge. "I'm Detective Webb. I understand you had an encounter 2 nights ago that might be related to your current condition." Jessica turned her head slowly. "Do you believe me?" she whispered. "The doctors think I'm crazy." "I don't think you're crazy, but I need you to tell me everything you remember, no matter how strange it seems." Over the next hour, Jessica recounted her encounter with Alexander Cross, the luxurious Setai penthouse, the strange red drink, and the night that had left her in this state. Webb took careful notes, asking specific questions about timing and descriptions. "The drink he gave you, can you describe its taste?" "Sweet at first, like fruit, but with a metallic aftertaste. Thick, not like normal wine. He called it lifeblood." Webb felt a chill. The phrase had connotations that went beyond simple translation, especially in certain folk traditions among Miami's diverse immigrant populations. After leaving the hospital, Webb headed to the Setai. The concierge who had worked Sunday night remembered Jessica clearly. A pretty young woman, well-dressed, asked for Mr. Cross in the Ocean penthouse. "And Mr. Cross?" "Older gentleman, distinguished, silver hair, very sophisticated. He'd been staying with us for a week. Paid everything in cash. Very private." Webb's investigative instincts sharpened. He paid cash for a penthouse suite? Very unusual. Paid the full amount up front in $100 bills. Said he preferred privacy. When Webb asked to see the Ocean penthouse, the manager explained it had been thoroughly cleaned and was occupied by new guests. Any physical evidence would have been long gone. Back at the station, Webb began searching for information on Alexander Cross. No Florida driver's license, no social security number matching his age and description, no credit card records or hotel registrations anywhere in Miami-Dade. Alexander Cross was a ghost, existing only in Jessica Torres's memory and a hotel concierge's testimony. That evening, Webb sat in his office studying Jessica's case file and medical reports that made no sense. He had his laptop open to multiple databases, searching for similar cases. What he found made his stomach turn. Over the past 9 years, 4 other young people between 22 and 32 had died in South Florida hospitals from unexplained tissue necrosis. All had been healthy before falling ill. All had been seen with older, mysterious individuals shortly before getting sick. In every case, the companions had vanished without a trace. Sarah Mitchell, in 2015, found dead in her Coral Gables apartment. David Richardson, in 2018, died at Mount Sinai Medical Center from organ failure. Brandon Cole, 2 years ago, died at Baptist Hospital while doctors struggled to understand his condition. And just 8 months ago, Ana Gutierrez, who had died at this very same Jackson Memorial. Webb pulled up the case files. All the investigations had been closed for lack of evidence, classified as unexplained medical cases. But every detective had hit the same wall. The victims had met mysterious older individuals who had disappeared without a trace. As Miami night settled over his office, Webb realized he wasn't investigating an isolated incident. He was looking at a pattern stretching back years, a predator moving through South Florida communities, selecting victims and vanishing like smoke. Jessica Torres might be the first victim to survive long enough to provide a detailed description, but according to medical reports, that survival was temporary. Whatever Alexander Cross had done to her was still working through her system, and time was running out. Webb closed his laptop and walked to his office window, looking out at Miami's lights stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape, he was certain Alexander Cross was still hunting, searching for his next victim. The hunt had begun, but Webb wasn't sure anymore who was the predator and who was the prey. And the most disturbing question haunted him. If this pattern had been going on for 9 years, how many other victims had there been that they hadn't connected yet? Jessica Torres died on a Friday morning at 6:23 a.m., while Miami stirred awake under a blanket of humidity and dawn light. The monitors in her isolation room at Jackson Memorial flatlined with mechanical precision, recording the end of a life that had been systematically drained over 6 agonizing days. Monica had been sleeping in the chair outside when the nurses rushed in, but there was nothing left to save. Detective Webb arrived at the hospital as the sun rose over Biscayne Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed obscene in contrast to the tragedy unfolding within the sterile walls. He had grown attached to Jessica in the brief time he had known her, admiring her determination to help catch her attacker even as her body failed her. "She was lucid until the end, Doctor," Jen told him in the hallway outside the now empty room. "She kept saying he would do it again, that we had to stop him before he found someone else." Webb nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility. In his 15 years as a detective, he had never had a victim die while actively cooperating with an investigation. It felt like a personal failure, though he knew conventional medicine could have done nothing. The forensic team would perform their examination, but Webb already knew what they would find. The same inexplicable tissue necrosis that had killed the 4 people before Jessica. The same absence of identifiable toxins or pathogens. Alexander Cross had perfected his technique over years, possibly decades, leaving behind only medical mysteries and grieving families. Webb contacted Dr. Patricia Reeves, the county medical examiner who had performed autopsies on 2 of the previous victims. She confirmed the identical patterns of tissue death, spreading systematically from the genital area through the lower abdomen in ways that suggested deliberate targeting rather than random infection. It's like something was deliberately consuming specific types of tissue and leaving others intact, Dr. Reeves explained over the phone. I've seen similar patterns in certain rare tropical diseases, but those require specific vectors we couldn't find. Webb's next call was to Dr. James Sullivan, an anthropologist at Florida International University who specialized in Caribbean and Latin American folk practices. When Webb explained his investigation, the professor's tone became grave. "You're describing very old, very dangerous practices," Dr. Sullivan said. "In various Caribbean traditions, Santeria, Vodou, Candomblé, there are rituals involving the transfer of life force from one person to another. Sexual ritual combined with specific herbal preparations. And the victims, they're consumed. Their vital energy feeds the practitioner, who uses the stolen energy to maintain youth and extend life far beyond natural limits. In Haiti, they're called bokors. In Cuba, brujos. They don't stay in one place. They move frequently, adopt new identities. If these practices actually work, Detective, I've spent 30 years studying these traditions. Whether it's supernatural or advanced plant chemistry, the effects are real. Your Alexander Cross could have been operating in South Florida for years, possibly decades." That afternoon, Webb's phone rang with a call from Miami Beach Police. "Detective Webb, this is Officer Martinez from the beach station. We got a strange call you might be interested in. A young man came in saying an older person approached him on a dating app, offering significant money for dinner tonight." Webb's blood ran cold. "Where?" "The Mandarin Oriental on Brickell Key. Claims to be staying in a Bayview suite, going by the name Victoria Sterling. The guy got spooked when he searched the name online and found nothing, thought it might be some kind of scam." "What's the potential victim's name?" "Ryan Cooper, 26 years old, lives in Wynwood. Works as a personal trainer." Webb was already grabbing his keys. "Don't let him leave the station. I'm on my way." The drive to Miami Beach felt interminable despite light afternoon traffic. Webb's mind raced through possibilities. It could be Alexander hunting again, perhaps now using a female identity. The speed of the next attack, with Jessica's body still warm in the morgue, suggested desperation, or perhaps the rituals required regular feeding to maintain their effectiveness. Ryan Cooper was exactly the type of victim Alexander seemed to prefer: young, attractive, economically vulnerable. He sat in the Miami Beach station looking nervous, but relieved that someone was taking his concerns seriously. "She messaged me yesterday," Ryan explained to Webb. "Said she was a businesswoman visiting from London, wanted sophisticated company for dinner, offered me $2,500, which seemed crazy just for dinner." Webb felt his pulse quicken. London, not Spain this time, but the same pattern. The amount was also higher than what had been offered to Jessica, suggesting inflation or growing desperation. Did she specify time or location? "Tonight at 9 at the hotel restaurant. Said to meet first in the suite for drinks." Webb immediately coordinated with Miami Beach Police to set up surveillance at the Mandarin Oriental. If this person was there, if they were real and not just another ghost, this might be their only chance to catch them before another victim was claimed. As night fell over Brickell, Webb positioned himself in the hotel lobby with a clear view of the elevators. Ryan Cooper wore a recording device and had instructions to call for backup at the first sign of danger. The plan was simple: let him make contact, gather evidence, then move in for the arrest. At 8:45 p.m., Webb watched Ryan cross the lobby toward the elevator. He looked nervous but determined, aware he was putting himself in danger to stop a killer. The lobby was filled with the usual mix of business travelers and tourists, providing good cover for the surveillance team. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Webb's radio remained silent. Ryan hadn't called for help, But he also hadn't made contact with Victoria Sterling. Finally, his earpiece came alive. "Detective, this is Officer Santos from Hotel Security. We just verified with the front desk. There's no Victoria Sterling registered in any Bayview suite. In fact, there are no reservations for those suites tonight." Webb felt a knot form in his stomach. The predator had vanished again, leaving behind only another near victim, and the growing certainty that they were always one step ahead of the law. Later that night, Webb stood on the waterfront behind the hotel, listening to the gentle lap of Biscayne Bay against the seawall. The investigation had consumed 6 days of his life, cost Jessica Torres her life, and ultimately led nowhere. Alexander Cross, or Victoria Sterling, or whatever name they used next, had dissolved into the shadows of Miami's vast urban landscape. But Webb had learned something crucial during those 6 days. He was hunting something that existed outside normal investigative parameters. Alexander wasn't just a killer using exotic poisons or psychological manipulation. This was something older, more dangerous, infinitely more patient. Somewhere in Miami that night, the predator was probably already selecting the next victim, scrolling through dating profiles, crafting messages designed to lure another young person toward their death. The cycle would continue because Webb didn't know how to break it with conventional police tools. As he walked back to his car, Webb made a decision. This case wouldn't be closed, wouldn't be filed away as another unsolved mystery. He would keep investigating, keep learning, keep building the file until he found a way to stop the entity that fed on Miami's young people like a parasite feeding on the city's vitality. Alexander Cross had won this battle, but the war was far from over.